The rain fell in sheets across the abandoned mining station on Kepler 442b, each drop striking the corrugated metal roof like bullets from heaven. Marcus Chin pressed his back against the cold wall of the shelter, watching the storm rage beyond the broken viewport. 3 days. 3 days since the evacuation ships had left without him, 3 days since he'd chosen to stay behind with the wounded rather than save himself. The medical bay hummed with the soft glow of emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the makeshift beds where 12 injured colonists lay in various states of recovery. Marcus had been the station's chief engineer, not a medic, but when the draconian assault had left their doctor dead and their evacuation window closing, someone had to make the choice. Someone had to stay. He flexed his cybernetic left arm, feeling the servos were softly beneath the synthetic skin. The prosthetic had been a necessity after the mining accident that had nearly killed him 2 years ago. The company had offered him a medical discharge, a pension, a chance to return to Earth and live comfortably. Instead, he'd chosen to stay, to prove that he was still capable, still valuable. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Once again, he'd chosen duty over safety. The sound of something scratching against metal drew his attention to the far corner of the medical bay. Marcus grabbed his plasma rifle and moved carefully toward the noise, his boots silent on the steel grating. The scratching came again, more urgent this time, followed by what sounded almost like crying. Behind a stack of medical supplies, huddled in a nest of torn insulation and debris, was the most extraordinary creature Marcus had ever seen. No larger than a house cat, the baby dragon was a marvel of evolutionary perfection. Its scales shifted from deep emerald to brilliant gold as it moved, each one no bigger than a fingernail but perfectly formed. Gossamer wings, translucent as stained glass, fluttered weakly from its shoulders. Its eyes, large and luminous, fixed on Marcus with an intelligence that seemed impossibly ancient for something so young. The creature was injured. A jagged piece of shrapnel had pierced its right wing, and dark blue blood, draconian blood, had pooled beneath its small body. It should have been afraid of him. Humans and draconians had been at war for 15 years, ever since first contact had gone catastrophically wrong. This baby species had reduced entire human colonies to ash and bone. And, yet, as Marcus knelt slowly beside it, the creature didn't flee. Instead, it chirped softly and tried to crawl toward him. "Easy there, little one," Marcus whispered, setting his rifle aside. The dragon's eyes never left his face as he reached out with his human hand. The moment his fingers touched its scales, the creature's distress seemed to diminish. It was warm, almost feverishly so, and he could feel a rapid heartbeat beneath the jewel-like armor of its hide. Marcus had seen enough battlefield medicine over the past 3 days to recognize critical trauma. The shrapnel needed to come out, and the wing membrane required immediate attention, or the creature would die within hours. He looked around the medical bay, knowing that using precious medical supplies on a draconian, even a baby one, would be seen as treason by any military court. But, as the dragon's small claws wrapped around his finger with surprising gentleness, Marcus found he didn't care about military courts or treason charges. "All right," he said softly, carefully lifting the creature. "Let's see what we can do." The dragon didn't resist as Marcus placed it on the examination table under the surgical lights. If anything, it seemed to relax at his touch, its breathing becoming steadier. Marcus had assisted with enough emergency procedures to know the basics, and the dragon's anatomy, while alien, followed logical patterns. The shrapnel had missed the major wing bones, if dragons even had bones in the traditional sense, but had torn through the delicate flight membrane like a knife through silk. As he worked, cleaning the wound and carefully extracting the metal fragment, Marcus found himself talking to the creature. "You know, little one, you picked a hell of a place to get hurt. This station's been abandoned for days. Your people hit us pretty hard during the evacuation." The dragon's head tilted as if it was listening, understanding. "Lost a lot of good people. My friend Sarah, she was going to be a teacher when we got back to Earth. Tommy Rodriguez, he had 3 kids waiting for him." The dragon made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace. The constant anxiety that had driven him since losing his arm, the desperate need to prove his worth, seemed to fade as he worked. His hands were steady, his mind clear. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his failures or his limitations. The wing membrane proved to be a greater challenge. The tissue was incredibly thin but remarkably complex, with a network of what looked like blood vessels but glowed faintly with bioluminescent properties. Marcus used the finest sutures available, working by feel as much as sight. The dragon remained perfectly still throughout the procedure, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost encouraging. "There," Marcus said finally, stepping back to examine his work. "Not perfect, but it should heal if you give it time." The dragon lifted its head to look at its wing, then back at Marcus. Then, to his amazement, it stood on unsteady legs and took a tentative step toward him. Marcus reached out instinctively, and the dragon climbed onto his palm with surprising agility. It was then that he noticed something remarkable. Where its claws touched his cybernetic arm, the prosthetic's neural interface began displaying readings he'd never seen before. Electromagnetic patterns that seemed almost like communication? The dragon settled into the crook of his arm, its warm body pressed against his chest, and promptly fell asleep. Marcus found himself reluctant to move, afraid of disturbing the small creature's rest. He settled into a chair beside the medical station's main console and pulled up the diagnostic readings from his prosthetic. What he saw defied every assumption about draconian intelligence and communication. The electromagnetic patterns weren't random, they were incredibly complex, layered with harmonic frequencies that seemed to convey multiple meanings simultaneously. It was as if the dragon was unconsciously broadcasting its thoughts and emotions, and his cybernetic arm was sophisticated enough to detect and partially interpret them. The primary emotion coming through was one Marcus recognized all too well: loneliness. Bone-deep, aching loneliness, coupled with fear and a desperate need for connection. But underneath that, he sensed something else: determination. This creature, barely larger than his hand, possessed a will to survive that humbled him. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself studying the patterns more intently. His engineering background helped him recognize the mathematical elegance of the communication system. It wasn't just emotion, there were data structures, complex information packages that seemed to contain everything from spatial coordinates to what could only be described as cultural concepts. The dragon stirred in his arms, its large eyes opening to focus on his face. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the creature did something that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life: it smiled. Not in the way humans smiled, but with an expression of such pure joy and trust that Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The patterns from his cybernetic arm shifted, and suddenly, Marcus understood. This wasn't just a baby animal seeking comfort. This was a sentient being, as intelligent and emotionally complex as any human, and it had chosen him. In a universe where their species were locked in mortal combat, the small dragon had looked past the conditioning and propaganda and seen him as simply another living being in need of connection. The weight of that realization settled on Marcus like a physical force. Everything he thought he knew about the war, about the enemy, about the fundamental nature of the conflict between their species, crumbled in an instant. If this creature could feel loneliness, could trust, could form bonds across species lines, then what did that say about the draconians who had been labeled as monsters? What did it say about the humans who had labeled them that way? Marcus spent the rest of the night reading and rereading the communication patterns, trying to understand the full implications of what he'd discovered. The dragon slept peacefully in his arms, occasionally shifting to press closer to his warmth. Each movement sent new waves of emotional data through his cybernetic interface, painting a picture of a being far more complex than humanity had ever imagined. When dawn broke over the storm-torn landscape of Kepler 442b, Marcuschen was no longer the same man who had chosen to stay behind 3 days ago. The scared engineer desperate to prove his worth had been replaced by someone with a deeper understanding of strength, and a terrible knowledge of what that understanding might cost him. The dragon woke with the morning light, stretching its tiny limbs and looking around the medical bay with curious eyes. It chirped softly when it saw Marcus watching, and the emotional feedback through his cybernetic arm conveyed something unmistakable: happiness. Pure, uncomplicated happiness at seeing him again. "Good morning to you too, little one," Marcus whispered. He'd been thinking about names during the long night, and one had come to him as he watched the dragon's scales shift color in the changing light. "I think I'll call you Prism." "You like that?" The dragon tilted its head, and the electromagnetic patterns shifted in what Marcus was learning to recognize as agreement. Prism. The name seemed to fit perfectly, a creature that revealed hidden truths when light passed through it in just the right way. Marcus checked on his human patients, all of whom were stable and recovering well. The medical bay's automated systems had kept them comfortable through the night, and several were beginning to show signs of waking. Soon, he would have to make decisions about Prism that he wasn't ready to make. Would the other colonists understand? Could they see past 15 years of propaganda and hatred to recognize the intelligence in those large, trusting eyes? As if sensing his thoughts, Prism climbed from his arm to his shoulder, balancing easily despite its injured wing. The small dragon pressed against the side of his neck, and the emotional feedback conveyed comfort and support. It was as if Prism was trying to tell him that whatever came next, they would face it together. The sound of approaching engines broke the morning quiet. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the distinctive whine of military shuttles. The rescue mission had finally arrived, but with it came the end of this strange, peaceful interlude. Soon he would have to choose between duty to his species and loyalty to a creature that had shown him the true meaning of courage. Prism seemed to sense the change in his mood. The dragon's scales darkened to a deep blue-green, and the electromagnetic patterns conveyed a complex mixture of fear and resignation. It knew what the approaching ships meant, knew that their time together was coming to an end. Marcus stood slowly, feeling the weight of the choice before him. He could hide Prism, try to smuggle the dragon away from the station and find some way to care for it in secret. Or he could turn it over to the military, knowing that it would likely be dissected in the name of scientific research. Neither option seemed acceptable. But, as the shuttles drew closer, Marcus realized there was a third choice. One that would require a different kind of strength than he'd ever shown before, the strength to stand up not just for what was right, but for what was true, regardless of the consequences. The hangar bay doors groaned open as the first shuttle touched down, its engines kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Marcus walked toward the landing platform with Prism perched on his shoulder, the dragon's claws gripping gently to maintain balance. With each step, he felt the old Marcus, the one driven by fear and insecurity, falling away. In its place was someone he'd never been before, a man who had found his strength not in proving himself to others, but in standing up for what he believed was right. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez was the first to emerge from the shuttle, her combat armor gleaming in the morning sun. Behind her came a squad of Marines, their weapons at ready as they swept the area for threats. Marcus had served under Martinez during the early days of the colony, and he knew her to be a good soldier and a decent person. If anyone would listen to what he had to say, it would be her. "Shun!" Martinez called out as she spotted him. "Thank God you're alive. We've been monitoring your beacon for days, but the storm made extraction impossible." Her voice trailed off as she noticed Prism on his shoulder, the dragon's scales shifting to a muted gray in response to the armed soldiers. "What the hell is that?" Marcus stopped 10 feet from the shuttle, close enough to speak clearly but far enough to avoid an immediate confrontation. "Her name is Prism," he said calmly. "She's a baby draconian, and she's under my protection." The effect of his words was immediate. Every Marine in the squad raised their weapons, targeting systems locking onto Prism with deadly precision. The dragon pressed closer to Marcus's neck, its electromagnetic output spiking with terror, but it didn't try to flee. Even facing certain death, it trusted him to protect it. "Shen, step away from the hostile," Martinez ordered, her sidearm now drawn. "That creature is an enemy combatant." "She's a baby," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "She was injured and alone when I found her. I treated her wounds, and she's been my companion for the past 18 hours. She's not hostile, she's intelligent, emotional, and capable of forming bonds across species lines." "Are you out of your mind?" Martinez took a step closer, her weapon trained on Prism. "These things destroyed Colony 7. They've killed thousands of our people." Marcus felt Prism tremble against his neck, the dragon's electromagnetic output now conveying not just fear but a deep, resigned sadness. It understood what was happening, understood that its very existence was seen as a threat by these armed humans. And, yet it remained still, trusting Marcus to find a way forward. "Colonel, I need you to listen to me," Marcus said, his cybernetic arm unconsciously moving to shield Prism from the targeting lasers. "Everything we think we know about the Draconians is wrong. They're not monsters, they're people, just like us. They feel fear, loneliness, love. They form bonds. They grieve their dead." "Chen, you're experiencing Stockholm Syndrome or some kind of psychological break," Martinez said, but Marcus could hear uncertainty in her voice. "Step away from the creature, and we'll get you the help you need." Marcus looked at the Marines surrounding him, saw the fear and hatred in their eyes as they stared at the small dragon on his shoulder. These were good people, soldiers he'd served alongside, but they had been shaped by years of war and propaganda just as he had been. They couldn't see past their conditioning to recognize the truth that was literally sitting in front of them. "My cybernetic arm has been receiving electromagnetic communications from her," Marcus continued, knowing he was running out of time. "Complex patterns that convey emotion, spatial data, even cultural concepts. She's not an animal, she's a person. A child who was separated from her family and injured in the fighting." Martinez's expression shifted slightly, doubt beginning to creep in. She'd known Marcus for years, knew him to be level-headed and rational. "Even if that's true," she said slowly, "she's still the enemy. We're at war, Chen." "Are we?" Marcus asked. "Or are we just afraid of something we don't understand?" The standoff stretched on, tension thick in the recycled air of the hangar bay. Marcus could feel Prism's heart racing against his neck, the dragon's electromagnetic output now carrying something he recognized as acceptance. She was preparing to die, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She'd experienced love and trust, even if only for a brief time. That seemed to be enough. The realization of what Prism was feeling broke something in Marcus's chest. This small, innocent creature was ready to die peacefully because she'd found connection with another being. In 18 hours, she'd shown him more courage and grace than he'd displayed in 32 years of life. "Colonel," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you're going to shoot her, you'll have to shoot me first. Because I'm not letting go." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could see the conflict playing out on Martinez's face, the struggle between duty and conscience. Around them, the Marines held their weapons steady, but he could sense their uncertainty. They'd signed up to fight monsters, not to execute a creature the size of a housecat that was clearly no threat to anyone. Prism lifted her head from Marcus's neck and looked directly at Martinez. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Marcus felt the electromagnetic patterns shift. The dragon was trying to communicate, sending out waves of what could only be described as hope mixed with a plea for understanding. Martinez lowered her weapon slowly. "Chen, I want you to understand something. If I allow this, if I let you keep that creature, you'll be facing court-martial. Treason charges. Your life as you know it will be over." Marcus looked down at Prism, who had turned to gaze up at him with those impossibly expressive eyes. The dragon's electromagnetic output conveyed a single, clear emotion: love. Unconditional, selfless love for a being who had shown her kindness when the rest of the universe had shown her only violence. "Colonel," Marcus said softly, "my life as I knew it ended the moment I realized what we've really been fighting. I can't go back to ignorance. I won't go back." The silence stretched on for what felt like eternity. Then, Martinez holstered her weapon and turned to her Marines. "Stand down," she ordered. "We're taking Chen and his companion back for debriefing. Let the brass figure out what to do with them." As the tension in the hangar bay began to dissipate, Marcus felt Prism's claws tighten gently on his shoulder. The dragon's electromagnetic output had shifted again, this time conveying something that took his breath away: gratitude. Not just for saving her life, but for seeing her as more than just an enemy. For recognizing her as a person worthy of love and protection. The shuttle ride back to the fleet was conducted in almost complete silence. Marcus sat in the passenger compartment with Prism curled in his lap, the dragon's presence a warm anchor in an uncertain world. Several Marines kept watch over them, But their earlier hostility had been replaced by curiosity. One young corporal even asked about the electromagnetic patterns Marcus had described, genuinely interested in understanding how draconian communication worked. As they approached the fleet, Marcus could see the massive bulk of the UESS Victory, humanity's flagship in the Kepler system. Soon he would be facing admirals and scientists, politicians and military tribunals. They would want to study Prism, to dissect her communication patterns and learn everything they could about draconian biology and culture. Some would see her as a weapon to be exploited, others as a threat to be eliminated. But Marcus no longer cared about their opinions or their judgments. He had found something on that abandoned mining station that was worth more than career advancement or social acceptance. He had found the strength that came from standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. Prism stirred in his lap, her scales shifting to a soft gold that matched the light filtering through the shuttle's viewport. She looked up at him with complete trust, and Marcus felt the familiar warmth of her electromagnetic communication patterns. This time, the message was simple but profound. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The docking bay of the Victory was a hive of activity as the shuttle touched down. Word of Marcus's discovery had apparently spread throughout the fleet, and the bay was filled with personnel eager to catch a glimpse of the first live draconian anyone had seen up close. Marcus could feel their eyes on him as he descended the shuttle's ramp with Prism still perched on his shoulder, but he walked with his head high and his steps steady. Admiral Rebecca Harrison was waiting for them at the base of the ramp, flanked by a team of scientists and military advisors. Marcus had never met the admiral personally, but her reputation preceded her. She was known for her tactical brilliance and her absolute dedication to humanity's cause in the war. Looking at her now, he could see the steel in her eyes that had made her famous throughout the fleet. "Mr. Chen," she said as he approached, her gaze fixed on Prism. "I understand you've had quite an adventure on Kepler 442b. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, feeling Prism's claws tighten slightly on his shoulder. The dragon's electromagnetic output conveyed nervousness but not fear. She trusted Marcus to handle the situation. "And this," the admiral continued, indicating Prism with a slight nod, "is the creature that's caused such a stir throughout the fleet." "Her name is Prism," Marcus said firmly. "She's not a creature or a specimen, she's a person. A child who was separated from her family and injured in the fighting." Admiral Harrison's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. "I see. And you believe this? Prism is intelligent?" "I know she is," Marcus replied. "My cybernetic arm has been receiving electromagnetic communications from her for the past day and a half. Complex patterns that convey emotion, spatial data, and cultural concepts. She's as intelligent as any human child her age, maybe more so." The admiral studied Prism for a long moment, taking in the dragon's jewel-like scales and expressive eyes. "Dr. Yamamoto," she said to one of the scientists flanking her, "is it possible for Mr. Chen's prosthetic to receive and interpret alien communication patterns?" Dr. Yamamoto, a thin man with graying hair and intense eyes, stepped forward. "The Mark 7 neural interface is sophisticated enough to detect electromagnetic signals across a wide spectrum," he said. "If the Draconians do communicate electromagnetically, it's theoretically possible that the prosthetic could pick up and partially decode their transmissions." "Interesting." The admiral turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to ask you to submit to a full debriefing. We need to understand exactly what happened on that station, and, more importantly, we need to verify your claims about draconian intelligence and communication." Marcus nodded. "I understand, ma'am. But I have one condition: Prism stays with me. She's been through enough trauma already. Separating her from the one being she trusts could cause permanent psychological damage." The admiral's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Mr. Chen. You're currently facing potential treason charges for aiding an enemy combatant." "Then, charge me," Marcus said calmly. "But I won't abandon her. She chose to trust me when every instinct should have told her to flee. I won't betray that trust, no matter what it costs me." Admiral Harrison studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Around them, the docking bay had grown quiet as personnel strained to hear the conversation. Finally, she nodded. Very well. For now, you and Prism will be housed together in a secure section of the medical bay. Dr. Yamamoto will oversee your debriefing and conduct initial tests on your communication claims. As they were escorted through the corridors of the Victory, Marcus couldn't help but notice the stares and whispers that followed them. Word of Prism's presence had spread throughout the ship, and everyone wanted a glimpse of the first live Draconian anyone had encountered. Some faces showed curiosity, others fear or hatred. But Marcus also saw something else: doubt. The sight of the small dragon perched peacefully on his shoulder was challenging assumptions that had been held without question for 15 years. The medical bay section they were assigned was more like a luxurious prison than a hospital room. The walls were reinforced transparent steel, allowing observation from the corridor, and the door could only be opened from the outside. But it was comfortable, with a proper bed, a small desk, and even a viewport looking out at the stars. Prism explored the new space with curiosity, her injured wing tucked carefully against her body. She seemed particularly fascinated by the viewport, pressing her small face against the glass and gazing out at the starfield beyond. The electromagnetic patterns Marcus received suggested wonder and longing. She was looking toward home. Dr. Yamamoto arrived within the hour, accompanied by a team of technicians carrying monitoring equipment. Mr. Chen, he said as they set up their devices, I hope you understand the magnitude of what you're claiming. If Draconians are truly intelligent, if they're capable of complex communication and emotional bonding, it would fundamentally change our understanding of this conflict. Marcus settled into the room's single chair with Prism in his lap. The dragon had grown comfortable with his touch over the past day, often seeking out contact when she felt uncertain or afraid. Doctor, what would it mean if I told you that she dreams? Yamamoto paused in his equipment setup. Dreams? Last night, while she was sleeping, my cybernetic arm picked up electromagnetic patterns that seemed to cycle through previous experiences. Visual data, emotional responses, even what appeared to be wish fulfillment scenarios. She was dreaming about flying, about being reunited with others of her kind. The doctor's eyes widened. That would suggest not just intelligence but self-awareness, memory formation, and complex psychological processing. He finished setting up a sophisticated electromagnetic monitoring array around Marcus's chair. Mr. Chen, if what you're saying is true, we've been fighting a war against people, not monsters. The implications hung heavy in the air as Dr. Yamamoto began his tests. He had Marcus describe his interactions with Prism in detail while the monitoring equipment recorded both the electromagnetic patterns from his cybernetic arm and Prism's own bioelectric emissions. As the hours passed, a picture began to emerge that supported everything Marcus had claimed. Prism's electromagnetic output was indeed sophisticated communication, layered with multiple levels of meaning and emotional content. When she looked at Marcus, the patterns conveyed affection and trust. When technicians approached too quickly, the signals spiked with fear and protective instincts. Most remarkably, when Dr. Yamamoto played recordings of draconian war calls, the terrifying roars that had accompanied every attack on human colonies, Prism responded with patterns that could only be interpreted as grief and distress. She's mourning, Dr. Yamamoto said quietly as he reviewed the data. Those war calls aren't battle cries, they're death songs. She's mourning the loss of her people. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. How many, do you think? How many have we killed without ever realizing they were people? The doctor didn't answer, but his expression said everything. The tests continued through the day, each one revealing new depths to Prism's intelligence and emotional complexity. She demonstrated problem-solving abilities, pattern recognition, and even what appeared to be artistic appreciation when shown various visual stimuli. But the most profound moment came when Dr. Yamamoto asked Marcus to try communicating specific concepts to Prism through touch. Marcus placed his hand gently on the dragon's back and tried to project the idea of friendship through conscious thought. His cybernetic arm registered the attempt as electromagnetic fluctuations, crude and simple compared to Prism's sophisticated patterns. Prism's response was immediate and overwhelming. Her scales shifted through a rapid spectrum of colors, and the electromagnetic patterns that flooded Marcus's consciousness conveyed joy, understanding, and something that could only be described as a welcome. She had understood his clumsy attempt at communication and was responding with the draconian equivalent of "hello, friend." Dr. Yamamoto stared at his instruments in amazement. "Mr. Chen, you just achieved first contact. Real, meaningful communication between humans and draconians. Do you understand what this means?" Before Marcus could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed the medical bay in red, and the intercom crackled to life with Admiral Harrison's voice, "All hands to battle stations. Multiple draconian vessels detected on approach vectors. This is not a drill." Prism's electromagnetic output spiked with terror as she recognized the significance of the alarms. But underneath the fear, Marcus sensed something else: hope. Her people were coming, but whether that meant rescue or revenge remained to be seen. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the fleet prepared for battle. Through the viewport in their secure room, Marcus could see the massive shapes of draconian vessels emerging from hyperspace, their organic curves and bioluminescent hull patterns beautiful and terrible in the starlight. These were the ships that had reduced human colonies to ash, but seeing them now, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what desperate parents might be aboard, searching for their lost child. Admiral Harrison arrived as the fleet was moving to battle formation, her expression grim but determined. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. If those ships are here for your dragon, is there any chance they'll negotiate rather than fight?" Marcus looked down at Prism, who was pressed against his chest, her electromagnetic output cycling through patterns of fear, hope, and longing. "Admiral, I think they're her family. Parents looking for their child. If you were in their position, would you negotiate?" The Admiral's jaw tightened. "And if we offered to return her?" "Then, you might just end a war," Marcus said quietly. Admiral Harrison stared at Prism for a long moment, then activated her communicator. "Bridge, this is the Admiral. Hold current position but do not initiate combat. And get me a channel to the lead draconian vessel." What followed was the most tense hour in the history of human-draconian relations. Using Marcus and Prism as intermediaries, Admiral Harrison attempted to establish communication with the approaching fleet. The process was crude and difficult. Marcus could only relay simple concepts through his connection with Prism, and her responses had to be interpreted by Dr. Yamamoto's equipment. But, gradually, a dialogue emerged. The Draconians were indeed searching for missing hatchlings. Several young dragons had been separated from their families during the evacuation of Kepler 442b. Prism wasn't the only one lost in the chaos of battle. The lead Draconian vessel, a massive bioship that dwarfed even the Victory, moved slowly into communication range. As it approached, Marcus could see structures on its hull that looked almost like viewing ports, and, behind them, the shapes of beings watching the human fleet with the same mixture of fear and hope that he'd seen in Prism's eyes. Admiral Harrison made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of demanding surrender or negotiating from a position of strength, she offered something unprecedented: a prisoner exchange. The humans would return Prism and any other Draconian young they had rescued, and, in return, the Draconians would return human civilians captured during the war. The response from the Draconian fleet was immediate and overwhelming. Through Prism, Marcus felt a wave of electromagnetic patterns that conveyed relief, gratitude, and something that might have been the Draconian equivalent of tears. Parents across two fleets were about to be reunited with their children. The transfer took place in the space between the two fleets, with shuttles from both sides meeting in the void. Marcus volunteered to personally escort Prism to the Draconian vessel, despite the obvious risks. As their shuttle approached the bioship, he could see it more clearly. Its hull wasn't metal but something organic, covered in scales similar to prisms that shifted color in response to some internal rhythm. The docking bay they entered was unlike anything in human design. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the air was filled with a faint luminescence that reminded Marcus of deep-sea creatures from Earth's oceans. Waiting for them was a delegation of adult Draconians, their massive forms somehow graceful despite their size. As Marcus stepped from the shuttle with Prism in his arms, one of the adult Draconians approached slowly. This one was clearly female, her scales a deep blue-green that matched Prism's coloring, and her eyes held the same ancient intelligence Marcus had first seen in the baby dragon. Prism's electromagnetic output exploded with joy and recognition as she saw the adult dragon. She launched herself from Marcus's arms with a strength that belied her small size, flying on her injured wing to nestle against the larger dragon's chest. The electromagnetic patterns Marcus received through his cybernetic arm were beyond anything he'd experienced before, a cascade of love, relief, and familial bonding that brought tears to his eyes. The adult dragon, Prism's mother, Marcus realized, approached him slowly. When she was close enough to touch, she did something that would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. She reached out with one massive claw and gently touched his cybernetic arm. The electromagnetic patterns that flooded his consciousness weren't translated words but pure emotion, gratitude beyond measure, and something that could only be described as recognition of kinship. Through Prism's translation, Marcus learned that the adult dragon's name was Star Weaver, and she was indeed Prism's mother. She had been searching for her daughter since the evacuation, driven by a parent's desperate love across the hostile gulf between their species. As the reunion continued, Marcus found himself in conversation with other members of the Draconian delegation. Through Prism's translations and his cybernetic interface, he learned about their culture, their history, and the tragic misunderstandings that had led to war. The Draconians were an ancient species, older than human civilization, who had achieved spaceflight through biotechnology rather than metal and electronics. Their ships were grown rather than built, their communication was electromagnetic rather than verbal, and their society was built around family groups and emotional bonds rather than hierarchical structures. The war, Marcus learned, had begun with a fundamental miscommunication. When humans had first encountered Draconian vessels, they had interpreted defensive postures as aggressive ones. The electromagnetic patterns that Draconians used for communication had been mistaken for targeting systems. First contact had devolved into violence within minutes, and both species had been locked in conflict ever since, each side believing the other to be inherently hostile. But now, watching human and Draconian children being reunited with their families, Marcus could see a different future taking shape. A future where two intelligent species could coexist and learn from each other, where the strength that came from understanding could replace the weakness born of fear. As the exchange concluded, Prism approached Marcus one final time. The small dragon climbed onto his shoulder and pressed against his neck, and the electromagnetic patterns that flooded his consciousness conveyed a message more complex than anything they had shared before. She was telling him that this wasn't goodbye. That the bond they had formed transcended species and politics. That he had shown her that courage wasn't about fighting enemies, but about standing up for what was right even when the whole universe seemed against you. And that she would carry that lesson with her always, just as she hoped he would remember what she had taught him about trust and love. Marcus felt his eyes fill with tears as he gently stroked Prism's scales one last time. "I'll never forget you," he whispered. "And I'll make sure others understand what you taught me." Prism's electromagnetic response was simple but profound, the same word she had learned from him on that first day, a friend. The shuttle ride back to the Victory was quiet, but the silence was different now. Marcus stared out at the stars, watching the Draconian bioship slowly turn away from the human fleet. He knew that when he returned to human space, he would face questions, investigations, and possibly court-martial proceedings. But he also knew that nothing they could do to him would matter. He had found the truth about strength, about courage, and about what it meant to be truly human. The man who had chosen to stay behind on an abandoned mining station, driven by fear and insecurity, was gone. In his place was someone who understood that real strength came not from proving oneself to others, but from standing up for what was right regardless of the consequences. The war between humans and Draconians didn't end immediately. There were still those on both sides who preferred conflict to understanding, who found it easier to hate than to learn. But Marcus Chen became the first human ambassador to the Draconian collective, working alongside former enemies to build a bridge between their species. Years later, when asked about the moment that changed everything, Marcus would tell the story of a baby dragon who wouldn't let go. How she had shown him that the greatest strength came not from fighting enemies, but from recognizing that there were no enemies, only people who hadn't learned to understand each other yet. And, sometimes, late at night when the embassy was quiet, Marcus would activate his cybernetic arms communication array and send a message out into the stars. A simple electromagnetic pattern that meant friend. And, somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, a dragon who had once been small and scared and alone would respond with patterns of her own, reminding him that some bonds transcended distance, time, and the arbitrary boundaries that divided the universe into us and them. The truth that shattered Marcusgen wasn't about war or enemies or the strength that came from fighting. It was about love, trust, and the courage required to see beyond the walls we build in our minds. It was about understanding that the man who destroys his weak self, the self driven by fear, hatred, and misunderstanding, can never be destroyed by others, because he has found something worth more than victory. He has found what it means to be truly alive. In the end, Marcus learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and choosing love anyway. It was about recognizing that in a universe filled with wonders and terrors beyond imagination, the greatest miracle of all was the capacity for two different beings to look at each other and choose connection over conflict, understanding over hatred, hope over fear. And that lesson, taught by a creature no bigger than his hand, would echo through the stars long after both their species had learned to call each other friend.